Today's title is My Mother Offered Me Money to Forgive My Brother for Getting My Fiancé Pregnant. I refused to forgive him, moved out, and cut all ties. I never expected my own mother to ask me to pardon my brother after such a betrayal. When she made her offer, it became painfully clear that she had no grasp of how much damage had been done. 3 years ago, I was engaged to a woman. I'll call her Liv. At the time, I truly thought she was my future. We had been together for nearly 5 years, and everything between us seemed stable. We were both lawyers with demanding schedules, but we always managed to make time for each other. The year I proposed should have been our happiest. Instead, it marked the beginning of the end. Liv was terminated from her job due to a policy violation. I won't go into details, but the situation was serious enough that she was let go immediately. If you've ever met a workaholic perfectionist, you'd understand how deeply this shattered her. Work wasn't just a job for her. It was a core part of her identity, her pride, her purpose. Losing it left her lost. She began job hunting immediately, sending out applications to any firm that seemed like a possibility. Unfortunately, given the circumstances of her dismissal, doors weren't opening easily. Months passed with no success. I did my best to reassure her, promising that she didn't have to stress about finances. I had everything covered. Since Liv tended to overthink, I encouraged her to take a step back and focus on her well-being. To my surprise, she actually listened. With so much free time, she decided to take up something she had always been interested in: landscaping. She signed up for a local course to immerse herself in it. Coincidentally, my younger brother, David, was in the same class. David and I couldn't have been more different. While I had always been goal-driven and responsible, David was impulsive, a serial flirt who never took anything seriously. Liv had met him early in our relationship and knew exactly what he was like. So when she mentioned that they were attending the same course, I thought nothing of it. They grew closer in the weeks that followed. Initially, I thought nothing of it. David sometimes gave her rides to class, which seemed like a nice gesture, if a little unexpected. Liv would come home energized, telling me about what she had learned and sharing photos of their projects. But soon, their time together extended beyond class. They started hanging out on weekends, visiting museums, and trying out new restaurants, the kinds of things Liv and I used to do together. She began canceling our date nights to be with him instead. I don't let suspicions fester. One evening, I confronted her directly and asked if something was going on between them. She was appalled by the question, insisting that they were just friends and that David felt like a younger brother to her. For a brief moment, I felt guilty for doubting her, but in my gut, I knew something wasn't right. Then, 2 months before the wedding, I learned the truth. I was working overtime to keep up with our bills and the wedding expenses, given that Liv was still unemployed. I barely had a moment to breathe between work and planning for our future. But despite my efforts, I had no idea I was being made a fool of. One night, I arrived home early from a business trip, hoping to surprise Liv. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed David's car parked outside. He had a habit of dropping by unannounced, but this was late. Past 9 p.m., something felt off. Stepping inside, I found the living room empty, though the TV was on. Empty beer cans littered the floor. And then, my eyes landed on an unmistakable item, an underwear tossed carelessly among them. My stomach twisted. I already knew what I was about to find, but I needed to see it for myself. Silently, I made my way to the bedroom and pushed the door open. There they were, Liv and David, tangled up in each other. They were so caught up in their betrayal that they didn't even notice me at first. Normally, I pride myself on keeping my emotions in check. But this was beyond forgiveness. I stepped into the room and grabbed David by the neck, wrenching him away from her. The moment of shock on his face was almost gratifying. He scrambled to explain himself, his expression shifting from confusion to pure fear. I wasn't in the mood for words. My fist connected with his nose. Liv screamed. David hit the ground, clutching his face as blood dripped between his fingers. He started begging me to stop. I didn't care. I kept hitting him, fueled by nothing but rage and betrayal. Then I stopped. I turned to Liv. She sat frozen on the bed, her face streaked with tears. Meeting her gaze, I told her she had 10 minutes to leave. If she wasn't gone by then, I wouldn't hesitate to throw her out myself. She sobbed, trying to explain, swearing she still loved me. I glanced at the clock. You have 9 minutes. That was all it took. She hurriedly threw her clothes into a suitcase, hands shaking. When she was done, she turned to me one last time, voice trembling, begging for another chance. Without a word, I went to her and slid the engagement ring off her finger and firmly guided her toward the door. She resisted, her voice cracking as she begged me to reconsider, but I had reached my limit. I yanked the door open and pushed her outside. She stumbled onto the porch, sobbing and screaming for another chance. Without hesitation, I slammed the door in her face. David was still on the floor, bloodied from our fight. As much as I was still seething with rage, I didn't want things to escalate beyond what had already happened. I called my parents and told them everything. My father was livid at David, while my mother was too stunned to respond, but they both said they were on their way. When they arrived, my mother, being a nurse, immediately tended to David's injuries, cleaning and dressing his wounds, which were thankfully just superficial. Meanwhile, my father pulled me aside, leading me to the backyard to help me cool down. He could see my hands were still trembling, my anger barely contained. David eventually came outside, his face swollen, nose bandaged, and his shirt still stained with dried blood. With a hesitant voice, he apologized for betraying me, insisting he never wanted things to unfold this way. Then, as if his words weren't infuriating enough, he dropped a bombshell. He claimed to be in love with Liv. That was the moment I finally turned to look at him, my fury reigniting. He went on to say he truly believed Liv felt the same way about him. As if that wasn't enough, he insisted that this was the first time they had slept together, like that somehow softened the betrayal. Then he pulled out his phone and showed me their messages. Conversations filled with flirtation, secrecy, and confessions from Liv about how unhappy she had been with me. As I read through them, my rage threatened to boil over again. David kept talking, saying he regretted what he had done, but that he had never felt this way about anyone before. My father, who had been silently listening up until that point, finally snapped. He told David he was lucky, because if it had been him in my shoes, David would have gotten far worse than a broken nose. My mother, however, had a different reaction. David had always been her favorite, and I could see how hard she was struggling to process the situation. She urged me to forgive him, insisting that families shouldn't be torn apart over a woman. To my shock, she even offered me money to cover the wedding expenses as if that would make things right. When I coldly told her I'd take the money but wouldn't forgive David, she immediately withdrew the offer. I cut her off before she could say anything else. I told my parents I wasn't in the mood for their input. I just wanted them to take David and leave. I couldn't stand the sight of him any longer. My father, understanding my need for space, helped David into the car. My mother lingered for a moment, clearly desperate to smooth things over, but eventually, she followed. In the aftermath, I was left picking up the pieces of my life. Liv bombarded me with messages, pleading for another chance, trying to justify what she had done. But it was always the same pathetic excuses. She and David never meant to hurt me, she claimed. I ignored her completely. Few months later, out of nowhere, David called me. He told me that Liv had just found out she was pregnant, and that the baby was his. He said they planned to get married and asked for my blessing. I refused, of course. My mother's reaction made everything worse. She had already been pushing for me to reconcile with David, but now she acted as though Liv's pregnancy was some kind of divine sign. She told me that maybe, just maybe, this was meant to be, that David and Liv were supposed to be together all along. It was a ridiculous attempt to justify the unforgivable. That was when I finally put my foot down. I told my mother outright that if she continued siding with David, she would lose me for good. My brother's betrayal was bad enough, but my own mother defending him? Unacceptable. My father stayed neutral, likely thinking that would somehow help, but it only made me resent him too. Meanwhile, my mother was relentless. She ensured Liv was financially taken care of, but of course, there was a catch. She insisted that David and Liv had to get married. She couldn't fathom the idea of her grandchild being born out of wedlock. When I found out that they had actually gone through with it and even sent wedding invitations to our relatives, I felt nothing but disgust. I kept my word and cut them both out of my life. But my mother wouldn't give up. She called me constantly, left endless voicemails, even showed up unannounced, trying to guilt-trip me into reconciling. It became suffocating. That's when I realized the only way to truly be free was to leave. So I moved to a different city, cut ties with nearly everyone except my father, and rebuilt my life from scratch. I changed my number and made sure no one could find me. 3 years passed. Then, yesterday, someone rang my doorbell. I opened it, and there stood Liv. I barely recognized her. She looked worn down, as if life had drained the spark from her. Beside her stood a little girl, no older than 3, holding her hand. One glance at the child's face, and I knew without a doubt, she was David's daughter. I stared at them, stunned. How had she found me? And what did she want? Breaking the silence, I finally asked, Liv, why are you here? Tears welled in her eyes as she pleaded to come inside, saying she had something important to tell me. My first instinct was to slam the door in her face. But then I looked at the little girl, her innocent eyes staring up at me. I sighed and stepped aside. Once inside, they settled on the couch while I sat across from them. I asked again, what do you want? Instead of answering, Liv reached into her bag, pulled out an envelope, and handed it to me. I recognized my mother's handwriting instantly. The letter was as infuriating as I had expected. My mother wrote that it was my responsibility to fix the mess David left behind. She said Liv and the baby were struggling, that David had abandoned them. And that as David's brother, I needed to step up. She even justified it by saying that Liv was almost my wife once, and the child was technically my niece. I looked at Liv, my patience wearing thin. What is this supposed to mean? That's when Lila broke down completely. She admitted that David had been unfaithful throughout their marriage, even after their child was born. 3 months ago, he packed up and vanished without a word, leaving her with nothing. No job, no savings, no home. My mother, desperate to help her granddaughter, had given Liv some money, but now that David was gone, she decided she was done helping. Instead, she wanted me to take responsibility for Liv and the child. I was disgusted. My mother had defended David, sided with him over me, and now, she expected me to clean up his mess? I told Lila, in no uncertain terms, that I owed her nothing. It wasn't my responsibility. I gave her just enough money for gas and sent her away. My mother had a golden child, and she refused to hold him accountable. And now, after all these years, she still expects me to pay for his mistakes. Well, I won't. Not anymore. And no, I don't want to adopt my niece. Regardless of Liv's financial or emotional situation, she's the mother, and it's her responsibility. I don't understand why she never worked after getting married, or why she didn't save money. David is the father, so even if they're separated, both Lila and David should take responsibility. David has no choice but to pay child support. Update 2. I talked to my parents about everything. I already knew my father had given my address to Liv, but I wanted to hear it directly from him. I called him and asked, without beating around the bush, why he agreed to share my location with her after I had repeatedly asked him not to. I also asked what he expected me to do for Liv and her daughter after all these years. My father was silent for a moment, clearly uncomfortable, then sighed deeply and apologized. "I'm sorry, son. Truly," he said. "We did everything we could to help Liv, but with David gone for so long, there was only so much we could do. Your mother begged me to give her your address. She thought that maybe if you saw her after so long, you might want to help in some way since she has nowhere else to go." I felt my frustration build. Why would you think I'd want to help someone like her? She betrayed me with David, hurt me, and now you expect me to help her? My father said he understood my anger. He explained that neither he nor my mother wanted things to end this way, but they were part of the family now. He thought I was their only option. He apologized again, but I didn't care. I told my father, firmly and without hesitation, to lose my number and forget I ever existed. Since he knew my address, I warned him that if he or my mother showed up at my house, I would call the police. He tried to apologize again, begging me to listen, but I was no longer interested. "Don't call me again," I said. "Just don't." I hung up the phone and immediately blocked his number. What my father did is unforgivable, and there's no going back. Update 3. It's been almost a month since my last update. I finally managed to locate David with the help of a friend. Turns out Liv was right. David has been living with his latest fling in a nearby city, pretending he has no responsibilities, as if he doesn't have a family. It doesn't surprise me. He's always been like this. I can't believe this is the same guy who, 3 years ago, told me with a serious expression that he was in love with Liv. The same guy who destroyed my life, and now, after all that, when he got tired of Liv and their daughter, he moved on to someone else. Liv knew this. She knew what my brother was like, but she still chose to betray me with him. So, I don't feel sorry for her. It's like being told something is hot but deciding to touch it anyway. You'll get burned. After finding out where he was, I sent Liv his location. I didn't want to get involved in their drama anymore, but I also didn't want to abandon a child who had no fault in the 2 idiots who were her parents. So, I gave one last piece of advice. You need to hire a lawyer and file for divorce and child support. Do it now before David disappears again. Liv thanked me, and I could hear the relief in her voice. She apologized again, but I was done listening. I sent her one final message. Don't contact me again. Don't show up at my door. This is the last thing I'll do for you. What we had, whatever it was, ended a long time ago. Stop disturbing my peace forever. Update 4. To explain this update, I need to provide some context about my brother. David never finished college, and since he dropped out, he's been getting by with temporary jobs. That's why he was taking a landscaping course. He wanted to find work in that area. But the types of jobs he usually gets allow him not to be tied down anywhere. And if you've read my previous updates, you know where this is going. Yes, my brother moved, or rather, fled. He knew Liv was trying to track him down to sue him for child support, so the first thing he did was run away from his ex-girlfriend's house. When Liv showed up there to confront him, he was already gone. The ex-girlfriend claimed she didn't know where he was. Whether that's true or not, no one knows. Meanwhile, I found out about all this because Liv emailed me again, asking me to help her track him down. I told her she had betrayed me again by not respecting my request not to contact me, so I wouldn't help her with anything. Then my parents showed up at my house. I won't bore you with the details because you already know why, but I told them I wouldn't spend another cent on this woman. I had already wasted too much on a wedding that didn't happen, and they thought that was okay. Then my mother offered to refund part of the money if I took responsibility. I laughed and told her, if you're willing to write a check right now, maybe I'll consider whether it's worth my time, which translates to, probably not. But she actually thought for a bit and wrote me a check for $5,000. That doesn't even cover a quarter of the cost of the wedding, but it was what she could manage. I told them to leave because the check didn't include the right to show up at my house. So, they left pretty quickly. It took me longer to deposit the check than to decide whether I would take Liv back. And the decision was, no. The good news is, the check cleared. I let my mother know over the phone, which she didn't like. According to her, if I accepted the money, I should at least honor what I promised. But even if I had signed a contract, the check was just for consideration, not a deal. Final update. My mother asked me to return the money, but I told her to sue me if she thought she had legal grounds. There's no written agreement, no text message, nothing. If she recorded our conversation, all she has is me calling to say I wouldn't help her. And then, the cherry on top, David showed up. Liv finally managed to serve him the papers. And guess what? He wants me to represent him. Good luck finding someone to do the work for free, because I'm not doing it, and he doesn't have any money. And good luck to Liv trying to get anything from my brother. If she wanted financial security, she shouldn't have chosen a loser.